I apologize, sir. I simply didn't wish to soil the interior.
In this rain? Why are you out here alone?
He built warmth for millions, but through the frost-covered glass he saw his maid eating alone in the snow, and everything changed. Snow drifted in slow spirals outside the Vale estate, blanketing the wrought-iron gates and the marble drive in quiet white. The world looked like perfection, every light calibrated, every hedge trimmed, every motion sensor blinking on cue. But beneath that polished beauty, a shivering figure sat on a stone bench just beyond the mansion's archway. Clara Morris wore a faded gray uniform and mismatched gloves. Her hair was tucked into a thin scarf that could not keep the cold from biting her neck. In her lap sat a dented lunchbox, its lid trembling in her gloved hands. She unwrapped a foil packet of rice and eggs, steam rising into the winter air, then shrinking fast into nothing. From the second-floor office window, Ethan Vale, founder and CEO of Neurodyne Systems, paused mid-call. At 38, he was the kind of man whose presence filled a room before he spoke, tall, lean, with piercing blue eyes framed by designer glasses. The world saw a visionary, a man who turned artificial intelligence into the backbone of winter safety across the country. The network of sensors and predictive systems his company designed had saved hundreds of lives from cold exposure. Yet, as Ethan stared down through the glass at the woman below, something in him tightened. His company had built warmth for cities, but not for the person right outside his own gate. "Ethan!" A voice crackled through his Bluetooth headset. It was Martin Shaw, his operations chief. "We need your approval on the neural patch deployment in Chicago." Ethan blinked, realizing he hadn't heard a word for the past minute. His attention stayed on the courtyard, the way Clara's shoulders hunched against the snow, the way she tried to hide her food when a gust of wind threatened to scatter it. "I'll review it later," he muttered, cutting the line. He turned from the window, but the image clung to him. Every angle of his home, every inch of the mansion's sterile luxury, suddenly felt wrong. The fireplace crackled behind him, feeding heat into a room that had never once felt truly warm. Ethan had built his empire on logic. Emotions were inefficiencies, he used to say. When investors praised his cold precision, he wore it like armor. But something about that woman, about the sight of a person trying to eat in a blizzard because she was afraid to make a mess indoors, unraveled a thread he hadn't known existed. He told himself it wasn't personal. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was memory. The way she cupped her hands around that cheap thermos reminded him of another winter, long ago, when his mother worked as a housekeeper in someone else's mansion. He had been 8, standing at the back door, watching her scrub marble floors through frostbitten knuckles. He'd promised himself he'd never live like that again. Now, decades later, he'd built the life he once envied, and in the process, become the kind of man his mother once served. A knock at his office door broke his thoughts. "Sir?" It was Dina, the household coordinator. "We've prepared lunch. Shall I set the table in the solarium?" He hesitated. "Not today." "Very well." She bowed slightly and disappeared. Ethan walked back to the window. Clara was still there. The snow fell harder now, clinging to her sleeves, melting against her cheeks. She tilted her face upward briefly, just long enough for him to see the exhaustion etched there, and then bent her head to eat. He pressed a hand to the cold glass. The barrier felt symbolic. He could control cities from this office, automate traffic lights to save lives, reroute heat grids in emergencies, but he couldn't reach the woman right below his window without first confronting what he had become. Ethan slipped on his coat, descended the grand staircase, and stepped into the storm. The blast of cold air stung like punishment. His polished shoes sank into the snow as he crossed the courtyard. Clara startled when she saw him. She scrambled to her feet, nearly dropping her food. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly, eyes wide. "I didn't mean to. I just didn't want to dirty the floors inside." Ethan stopped a few feet away, his breath visible in the freezing air. For a moment he couldn't find words. He should have told her to go inside, that no one deserved to eat like this, but the words that came out were softer, quieter. "You're freezing." Clara clutched her lunchbox tighter. "I'll finish quickly, I promise." Ethan nodded once and turned back toward the mansion, but something in his chest ached as he walked away. Her apology echoed behind him, not for failing her job, but for existing where she wasn't supposed to be seen. That night, the blizzard thickened. Wind battered the glass, howling through the trees. Ethan sat in his dim office, the sound of the storm matching the churn inside his head. He had spent years automating compassion, creating systems that simulated care so people wouldn't have to. But machines couldn't feel guilt. Machines couldn't fix what he had ignored in his own home. And now, one image, his maid eating alone in the snow, refused to leave him. The storm raged through the night, but Ethan barely noticed the sound anymore. The memory of Clara sitting in the snow replayed in his mind like a glitching loop. Her small lunchbox, her blue lips, the quiet apology that wasn't for any real mistake. He rose before dawn, restless. The mansion was silent except for the hum of the central heating system, one of Neurodyne's early prototypes. Every vent in the house exhaled perfectly calibrated warmth, yet the air still felt cold. Ethan poured coffee into a glass mug and sat at the marble counter. Across from him, the digital wall display rotated through graphs, energy efficiency reports, system updates, projections for their upcoming winter-safe rollout. His company could predict frost patterns 5 days in advance. They had partnered with entire cities to prevent deaths caused by hypothermia, but the woman working for him couldn't even eat her lunch indoors. He shut off the screen. Later that morning, as the stormlight filtered pale through the high windows, Ethan found himself walking down the service hall. It had been years since he'd gone there, where the staff lockers and maintenance closets were kept, out of sight. The floor smelled faintly of cleaning detergent. When he reached the far end, he saw Clara. She was wiping down the silver sconces, her gloved hands trembling from the cold that had never quite left her bones. "Clara," he said. She turned so fast she nearly dropped her cloth. "Mr. Vale." "Sir, good morning." Her voice was polite but nervous, her posture straight, as if preparing for reprimand. "You've been here since dawn?" "Yes, sir." The snow tracked mud near the east hall. He hesitated. "Why didn't you take breakfast inside the kitchen?" She blinked, unsure how to answer. "The staff usually eat after the guests, sir." "There are no guests." Clara gave a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Habit, I suppose." He nodded toward the window. "It's -6 degrees outside. If you ever eat lunch again out there, you'll freeze before you finish." Her hands froze on the cloth. "I'm sorry, sir. A guest complained last winter that I smelled like bleach after cleaning the marble steps. I didn't want to bother anyone." Ethan's chest tightened. "Bother anyone," he repeated softly. She looked down. "I can take my meal in the basement, if you prefer." He stared at her, the absurdity hitting like a blow. "Clara, I didn't come here to scold you. I came because it shouldn't be this way." She frowned slightly, uncertain what he meant. "I appreciate that, sir. I'll make sure not to repeat the mistake." He wanted to say more, to tell her she hadn't made a mistake at all, but years of being distant had left him with no vocabulary for comfort. He gave a quiet nod and stepped aside to let her pass. When she was gone, Ethan remained in the empty hallway, the scent of detergent sharp in the air. He thought of his mother again, kneeling on the cold tile floors, humming softly while she scrubbed. He had told her he would buy her a mansion one day so she'd never have to clean one again, but she hadn't lived long enough to see it. And now, here he was, surrounded by everything he'd once dreamed of, and none of it felt right. That night, he sat by the fireplace with a stack of old project notes. Neurodyne's mission statement stared back at him from the top page. To create systems that make the world safer, one innovation at a time. The words had sounded noble when he first wrote them. Now they looked sterile, hollow. He reached for his mother's old photo on the mantel. Her smile was faint, her eyes tired but kind. "I built the warmth, Mom," he murmured, "but I forgot what it's for." The next morning, he arrived at headquarters early. Neurodyne's Boston Tower shimmered against the fading snow, its glass facade reflecting the pale winter sun. Inside, the staff hurried through the lobby. Engineers, analysts, executives, all dressed in sleek black coats. As Ethan crossed the marble floor, a junior manager fell into step beside him. "Sir, the Chicago network went live overnight. 0 outages." "Good," he said absently. "Also, the board wants to discuss expansion to Montreal. They believe—" "Postpone it." The manager blinked. "Sir?" "I said postpone it. We're recalibrating priorities." He left the man standing in confusion and entered the elevator. His reflection stared back. Impeccable suit, perfect tie, calm authority. But beneath the polished image, something had shifted. That evening, he asked for Clara's personnel file. The head of staff hesitated before handing it over, confused but compliant. Ethan read through every line. Widowed, 1 dependent, address in Dorchester, no disciplinary notes, commendations for diligence, no complaints. He stared at the small note beside her emergency contact. Jamie Morris, age 8. When he left the office that night, he didn't drive home. He drove across the frozen Charles River into Dorchester, following the address on the file. The neighborhood was old, the kind of place where porch lights flickered and cracked paint peeled from door frames. Snowbanks lined the sidewalks and the streetlights buzzed with weak yellow light. Ethan parked and walked the last block, his breath visible in the air. From the third-floor window of a narrow brick building, he saw Clara's shadow move across the curtain. Inside, a child coughed, a deep, rough sound. Clara knelt beside a small bed, wrapping the boy in blankets, her hands trembling as she held a worn inhaler to his mouth. Ethan stood in the snow, invisible, the cold biting his face as he watched. The boy's cough eased. Clara leaned forward and pressed her lips to his forehead, whispering something Ethan couldn't hear. Then the light flickered once, twice, and went out. The power grid in the building had failed. Ethan looked up at the darkened window, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He pulled out his phone, dialing his driver to bring portable heaters from the mansion. But halfway through the call, he stopped, because for the first time in years, he realized something. All his technology, all his networks, all his wealth, it meant nothing if warmth couldn't reach this small apartment. He slid the phone back into his pocket and stared up at the dark window until his breath turned white in the night air. The streetlights flickered weakly as Ethan stood in the falling snow. The hum of the city felt distant here, just the wind, the crunch of ice beneath his shoes, and that darkened third-floor window. He could still see Clara's faint silhouette inside, moving by the light of a small battery lantern. The thought of her and her child sitting in that cold apartment twisted something deep inside him. For years, Ethan had believed compassion could be automated, that warmth could be coded into algorithms. But what he saw now wasn't a technical failure. It was a human one. He turned back toward his car, the black sedan idling at the corner. "Drive to the Vail Foundation offices," he said to his driver, his voice steady but low. "Now." "Sir, it's nearly midnight." "I know." The car glided through snow-choked streets until they reached the downtown tower, his other empire, the one built to make him look generous. He let himself in with his keycard, the echo of his footsteps bouncing through the marble lobby. Inside the executive suite, screens blinked awake as motion sensors detected him. His reflection appeared across the glass, a man who had spent a decade perfecting efficiency while forgetting empathy. He opened the system dashboard for Neurodyne's WinterSafe network. Millions of connected devices mapped across the country. Street sensors, heat monitors, digital alerts, but nothing in the data showed the human faces they were meant to protect. Ethan started typing. His fingers moved faster than they had in years. He bypassed the usual channels, rewriting the emergency distribution parameters, adding a new field. Household Hardship Index. He linked it to existing city welfare data, emergency clinic records, and power outage grids. Within an hour, he had built the foundation for a new initiative, one that would automatically reroute backup generators to low-income neighborhoods first. He named it Project Hearthlight. When he was done, he stared at the code lines glowing across the screen. His pulse was racing. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for once, it felt like the right kind of work. By dawn, the city had quieted. The blizzard had thinned into gentle snow. Ethan drove back to Dorchester and parked near Clara's building. He waited until the first hint of daylight before climbing the icy steps. He knocked softly. After a moment, Clara opened the door, her hair pulled back, her eyes shadowed from exhaustion. "Mr. Vale?" she said in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" He glanced past her into the dim apartment. The walls were thin, the heater dead, a child's drawing taped beside the window, crayon sketches of snowmen and stars. The air was bitterly cold. "May I come in?" he asked. She hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course." Jamie, her son, stirred on the couch beneath a pile of blankets. Clara adjusted them gently before turning back to Ethan, embarrassment coloring her face. "The heat went out last night. I was going to call the landlord this morning." Ethan's gaze swept the small space. "You shouldn't have to live like this." Her shoulders stiffened. "I'm managing, sir. We always manage." He met her eyes. "That's the problem. You shouldn't have to just manage." She said nothing, unsure what he meant. Ethan crouched beside the broken radiator, checking its ancient valves. "This building's grid connection is part of the older sector," he murmured. "It wasn't prioritized during outages." Clara frowned. "How do you know that?" He stood and brushed frost from his gloves. "Because I built the system that forgot about places like this." Her brow furrowed, not understanding. "Sir? I came here to see how much I've missed," he said quietly, "and I think I'm just starting to learn." She stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for mockery or pity. There was none. Only regret. He pulled a small card from his coat and handed it to her. "You'll get a call today. A team from the Vale Foundation. They'll install new heating, repair your wiring, and set up medical coverage for Jamie. No cost." Her lips parted, disbelief flooding her features. "Mr. Vale, I can't accept charity." "This isn't charity," he interrupted softly. "It's accountability." Clara's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide by turning away. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't," Ethan replied. "Just stay warm." He looked once more at Jamie's sleeping form, the child's hand clutching a small toy truck with a missing wheel, before stepping back into the cold. As he descended the stairs, the morning light spilled across the snow-covered street. He inhaled deeply, the air sharp in his lungs. Something inside him felt both heavy and light. Guilt and purpose intertwined. By the time he reached the car, his phone buzzed with a flood of notifications, missed calls, bored messages, the usual chaos. He ignored them all. For the first time, the noise of his empire felt smaller than the quiet good he could finally do. He looked back once toward the window. Inside, Clara was kneeling beside her son, wrapping him in a blanket. The faint yellow light from a lantern flickered across their faces. The storm had ended, but for Ethan Vale, it was only beginning, the kind that stripped everything false until only truth remained. Snow still clung to the edges of Boston's sidewalks, gray now with the soot of passing cars, but Ethan barely noticed the city around him. He spent the morning in motion, meetings, calls, decisions, but his mind stayed elsewhere. Every spreadsheet he reviewed blurred into the image of Clara's frozen apartment and her son's labored breathing. By noon, his assistant knocked. "Mr. Vale, the investors are waiting in the boardroom." He nodded automatically, slipping on his jacket and walking toward the glass-paneled room that overlooked the city skyline. The walls gleamed. The table reflected his reflection and 12 others, men and women who measured progress in numbers, not people. "Ethan," said Gregory Hinton, his CFO, with an approving smile. "I saw the overnight report. Profits from the WinterSafe network are up 12%. Expansion to Canada will double that by spring." Ethan set his folder on the table. "We're not expanding." A silence fell. Gregory blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "We're not expanding," Ethan repeated evenly. "Not until we correct the oversight and local coverage. Our city grid left hundreds of low-income areas unprotected during the last storm." Another board member, Valerie Kim, frowned. "Ethan, with respect, our public statement already addressed that. The outages were beyond our scope. Private landlords, not us." Ethan met her gaze. "That's convenient and wrong." The room stiffened. Gregory's smile thinned. "Ethan, you built this company on efficiency and scalability. This isn't the time to turn it into a charity." "It's not charity," Ethan said quietly. "It's correction." He slid a report across the table, his handwritten notes from the night before. "We're launching Project Hearthlight. It integrates welfare data, prioritizes energy reroutes for neighborhoods most at risk, and funds emergency heating repairs for residential buildings under a new foundation grant." Valerie flipped through the pages, her tone half incredulous, half admiring. "You wrote this yourself?" "Last night." Gregory leaned back. "And how exactly are we funding this? Idealism?" Ethan's eyes were steady. "My salary, for a start. Then the unused executive bonus pool. And if that's not enough, I'll liquidate 10% of my shares." Shock rippled around the table. "Ethan, that's—" Gregory began, but Ethan cut him off. "Non-negotiable." The room fell silent again. Only the faint hum of the heating system filled the air. Outside, snow drifted past the tall windows, reflecting off the steel and glass towers below. Valerie studied him for a long moment. "You've changed," she said finally. He almost smiled. "Maybe I finally remembered why I started." After the meeting, word spread fast through the company. Rumors of the CEO donating his bonus, talk of ethics and legacy. Some employees were skeptical, others quietly inspired. But Ethan didn't care about opinions anymore. He cared about results. That afternoon, he drove to a nearby school where Neurodyne's outreach division had been scheduled to present STEM scholarships. Normally, he would send a representative. This time, he went himself. The auditorium smelled of chalk and cafeteria pizza. Dozens of children sat bundled in puffy jackets. The principal, a cheerful woman with tired eyes, greeted him warmly. "Mr. Vale, thank you for coming. The kids have been studying your AI systems." He nodded, distracted, until he spotted a familiar face among the children. Jamie, Clara's son. The boy's cheeks were pale, but his eyes bright, a sketchbook open on his knees. Ethan walked over. "That's impressive work," he said, noticing a drawing of a city lit by glowing blue dots, heat grids, perfectly drawn. Jamie looked up shyly. "I saw it on TV. It's your company, right? The one that keeps people from freezing." Ethan hesitated, then smiled. "It tries to." Jamie held out the sketchbook. "I think if people could see where the heat goes, they'd understand how important it is." The words hit Ethan like a revelation. Simple, pure, and painfully true. "You're a smart kid," he said softly. "Your mom must be proud." Jamie nodded. "She says you work really hard." Ethan looked at him for a long moment before glancing at the school window, where the snow was falling again, soft, relentless, and silent. When he left the school, he stood by his car for a moment, the cold wind whipping his coat. For years, he'd believed success meant isolation, that being untouchable was power. But now, he understood that warmth only mattered when shared. That night, back at the mansion, Ethan sat at his piano, an instrument he hadn't touched in years. His mother had taught him once, saying music could thaw the coldest parts of a person. The notes felt rusty under his fingers, uncertain at first, but then familiar. As he played, the melody carried through the halls, soft and searching. Somewhere deep in the house, Clara paused her cleaning, listening in disbelief. She hadn't known he played. The music lingered even after the final note faded, settling into the air like warmth that didn't need a thermostat. When the last echo disappeared, Ethan looked at the empty room around him and whispered, "Maybe she was right, Mom. Maybe warmth starts here." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but for the first time in years, the mansion didn't feel cold. Morning broke slow and gray over the city, the storm now a soft memory dusting the rooftops. Inside the Vale mansion, light filtered through tall frosted windows, turning the marble floors into mirrors of pale gold. But Ethan was already awake, dressed, focused, and standing at his study window as the first flakes began to drift again. He hadn't slept much. His thoughts had circled all night around one truth. For all his precision, his empire had failed the very people it claimed to protect, and somehow that failure had a face, Clara's. His phone buzzed with a message from Gregory. "Investors concerned about optics. Call me immediately." He ignored it. Instead, he opened his laptop and began typing a memo titled Operational Reassessment, Human Impact Review. He outlined a plan that required every division of Neurodyne to document not just efficiency metrics but the real-world effect of their systems. Photos, testimonies, outcomes. For the first time, data alone wouldn't be enough. At 9, he called for Clara. She appeared at the door, hesitant. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Ethan gestured toward the seat across from his desk. "Come in, Clara, please." She sat gingerly, her hands folded in her lap. "If this is about yesterday, It's not," he said quickly. "This is about something else." She blinked, wary but curious. Ethan leaned forward. "I visited your apartment. I saw the heater." Color drained from her face. "Sir, I didn't mean for you to—" He raised a hand gently. "Don't apologize. You've done nothing wrong. I'm the one who should be apologizing." Clara's brow furrowed. "For what?" "For forgetting where I came from," he said quietly. "For building warmth everywhere except where it matters most." Her eyes softened, confusion giving way to something like empathy. "Mr. Vale, you've done so much already." "Not enough," he interrupted. "That's going to change." He slid a folder toward her. Inside was an official letter. Vale Foundation, stamped and signed. "This is for you. You're being promoted to Household Operations Manager. Better hours, higher pay, full health coverage for you and your son. And I've already arranged for a new heating unit to be installed in your building by tomorrow morning." Her lips parted, words catching in her throat. "Sir, this can't be real." "It's real," Ethan said. "And it's overdue." Clara covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," he said softly, "by reminding me what matters." Her eyes glistened. "I didn't mean to." "I know," Ethan said, smiling faintly. "You just did what you had to do, and that's exactly what changed me." For a moment, silence filled the room, warm and unhurried. Then Clara whispered, "Jamie will be so happy." Ethan nodded, a flicker of emotion crossing his usually controlled face. "He's a bright kid. I saw his drawings." Her head snapped up. You met him?" "At his school," Ethan said. "He's got your courage." Clara looked away, embarrassed by the compliment. "He's all I have left." The way she said it carried weight, a story hidden beneath exhaustion. Ethan didn't press. But something in him stirred again, that quiet ache that came whenever compassion met memory. After she left, Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the flickering fireplace across the room. He thought about the years he'd spent chasing innovation, the deals, the headlines, the illusion of control. Somewhere along the way, he had built walls of glass around his life, mistaking transparency for connection. But all it had done was keep warmth out. That afternoon, Gregory stormed into his office without knocking. "Ethan, what in God's name is going on? Donors are calling me about this Project Hearthlight, half the board's in panic mode." "Good," Ethan said. Gregory froze. "Good?" "Yes," Ethan replied, voice calm but firm. "Because panic means we're finally doing something that matters. Do you realize what you're risking? Your position, your investors, everything you built." Ethan stood, his posture composed but his tone sharper than ice. "I built this company to protect people, Greg. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. If doing the right thing costs me investors, then maybe they weren't the kind of people I should have built with." Gregory exhaled, stunned. "You're serious?" "More than I've ever been." He turned toward the window again, watching snow drift across the skyline. "I used to think success meant never feeling the cold again," he murmured. "But now I think it's knowing someone else doesn't have to." Gregory stared at him, silent for a long time, before finally nodding once. "Then I'll start drafting the release." When Ethan was alone again, he allowed himself a small, tired smile. The air in the room felt lighter somehow, as if something heavy had finally shifted. That evening, as the snow began to fall again, Clara walked home under the dim glow of streetlights. When she opened her apartment door, Jamie was waiting by the window, his face pressed to the glass. "Mom, look!" he shouted. "The heater's working!" Clara froze. Warm air was filling the room, soft and steady. For the first time in months, their breath didn't fog in front of them. On the table sat a small envelope with the Vail Foundation's seal. Inside, a note in Ethan's clean, deliberate handwriting. No one should ever eat in the snow. Clara sank to her knees, clutching the letter as tears blurred her vision. Back at the mansion, Ethan stood once more at the same window where he had first seen her days ago. Snow fell quietly over the courtyard. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone watching it. The city had thawed slightly by the next morning, though traces of ice still shimmered along the edges of the streets. Boston was waking up slowly, exhaust curling from bus engines, salt trucks growling through intersections, the world returning to motion. But inside the Vail mansion, something fundamental had shifted. The staff noticed it first. The man who once walked through the halls with a quiet, untouchable authority now paused to greet them by name. The house, once ruled by silence and polished surfaces, had begun to breathe again. Clara arrived early that day, still not used to her new title. The crisp uniform she'd been issued carried her name embroidered neatly above the pocket. Clara Morris, Household Operations Manager. She traced the lettering with her finger before stepping through the main doors. Ethan was already in the kitchen. To her shock, he wasn't in a suit but a simple wool sweater, sleeves rolled to his forearms. He was pouring coffee, 2 cups. "Good morning," he said without looking up. Clara froze at the threshold. "Mr. Vail, sir, should I get someone to prepare your breakfast?" He turned and smiled faintly. "I think I can handle a coffee pot." He slid 1 cup across the counter toward her. "Join me, if you have a minute." She hesitated. "I shouldn't." "Please," he said. "Call it a meeting. I'm your employer, not your warden." The joke was gentle, but it disarmed her. Slowly, Clara sat, hands trembling slightly around the warm mug. Ethan leaned against the counter, studying her face for a long moment. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally. She blinked. "Me?" "For showing me the truth without meaning to." "I don't understand." He took a sip of his coffee, eyes distant. "My company was built to prevent suffering, but somewhere in the equations I forgot what real suffering looked like. You reminded me, without saying a word." Clara's throat tightened. "I just did my job, sir." "That's exactly what makes it powerful," Ethan said softly. "You showed dignity even when no one gave it to you." The words landed heavier than either expected. For a moment, neither spoke. The ticking of the kitchen clock filled the space between them. Finally, Clara set down her cup. "You shouldn't thank me, Mr. Vail. You've done more for me than anyone in my life." Ethan looked down, a flicker of humility passing across his face. "It's not charity. You've earned everything, and I'm not done yet." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He smiled. "You'll see soon enough." A knock interrupted them. Dina, the coordinator, appeared at the doorway with a hesitant expression. "Sir, there's someone from the Boston Chronicle here for a statement. They heard about Project Hearthlight." Ethan glanced at Clara, then back at Dina. "Send them in." Within minutes, a young journalist entered. Coat dusted with melting snow, notebook clutched tight. "Mr. Vale, thank you for your time. Your new initiative is creating quite a stir. People are calling it the Heart of Winter. May I ask what inspired it?" Ethan hesitated. The question felt heavier than it sounded. His eyes flicked toward Clara, who stood quietly by the counter, unsure if she should leave. He answered slowly. "Inspiration rarely comes from brilliance. It usually comes from humility, from seeing something you should have seen long ago." The journalist nodded, intrigued. "Was there a particular moment?" "Yes," Ethan said, his voice soft but steady. "There was." He didn't elaborate. Clara kept her gaze lowered, but her hands trembled as she folded a towel. After the reporter left, Clara turned to him, her face pale. "You didn't have to protect me like that." "I wasn't protecting you," Ethan replied. "I was protecting what you represent." She looked puzzled. He walked to the window, staring at the snow-covered courtyard where he had first seen her days ago. People forget that kindness doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly, doing its work while the world looks away. That's what you did. That's what I failed to see. Clara swallowed hard. "You're giving me too much credit." "No," he said, turning back to her. "Just enough." That night, the story broke online. CEO launches Hearthlight initiative to protect Boston's forgotten families. News anchors praised the boldness of his plan, but none of them knew that the real story began with a lunchbox in the snow. Ethan didn't read the coverage. He sat by the window again, watching the lights across the frozen Charles River. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed faintly through the cold air. He thought about his mother, how she used to hum while scrubbing floors in winter, her fingers red from the cold, her smile unbroken. He thought about Clara, carrying that same quiet strength. And he wondered how many others like her had slipped through the cracks of the systems he built. When the phone rang, he answered automatically. "Ethan, it's Gregory. The Chronicle articles everywhere. The public response is incredible. Donors, cities, everyone wants in. You've started something big." Ethan stared out at the snow falling under the streetlight. "Good," he said. "Let's make sure it stays honest." Gregory chuckled softly. "You sound different these days." "Maybe I am," Ethan said. "Maybe I'm finally human again." When he hung up, he noticed the scarf draped over the chair beside him, gray-blue wool, worn at the edges. Clara had forgotten it earlier that morning. He picked it up, running his fingers over the rough fabric. It was old, clearly repaired several times, but still warm. Something about it struck him deeply. The way the threads held together despite the wear, the way its color matched the winter sky. He folded it carefully and set it on the mantel. Outside, the snow thickened once more, but for the first time, Ethan didn't dread it. The cold no longer symbolized distance or indifference. It was a reminder, a promise that warmth, once found, must be shared. The next morning arrived clear and painfully bright. The kind of winter sunlight that looks warm through glass but burns cold against the skin. Frost clung to the wrought iron gates as Ethan's car pulled out of the mansion drive, gliding toward downtown Boston. He had a full day ahead. Press interviews, donor calls, and a televised panel about corporate responsibility, but something about those words felt hollow now. His driver, a quiet man named Reed, noticed Ethan's pensive silence. "You all right, sir?" Ethan nodded faintly, eyes on the snow-covered sidewalks flashing past. "Just thinking about what comes next." Reed smiled through the rearview mirror. You've been doing that since the day I met you." Ethan almost laughed. "Maybe this time I'm thinking differently." By 9 o'clock, the Neurodyne headquarters was buzzing with energy. Reporters crowded the lobby, photographers snapping through the glass. A week ago, none of them would have cared about the CEO's humanitarian projects. Now, they were calling him the Winter Reformer. He hated the name. Inside the executive elevator, Ethan straightened his coat and adjusted his tie. The mirrored walls reflected a man who looked composed, successful, but beneath the fabric and polish, he felt raw. When he stepped onto the executive floor, the hum of conversation died down. Staff whispered as he passed. It wasn't fear this time. It was curiosity. Respect, even. Gregory met him outside the conference room, holding a stack of reports. "We've had over 200 heating repairs completed under Hearthlight this week. The city council's requesting a partnership expansion." Ethan nodded, scanning the figures. "And the PR?" "Glowing," Gregory said, half grinning. "You've become a symbol, Ethan. People think you're rewriting what leadership means." He set the papers down and leaned closer. "But I have to ask, what's driving this? You're donating millions. You're pushing the company to restructure. This isn't just guilt. What's really going on?" Ethan hesitated, his blue eyes distant. "Let's just say I remembered the view from the other side of the glass." Before Gregory could respond, Dina appeared in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "Sir, there's someone here asking for you. She didn't have an appointment." Ethan frowned. "Who?" Dina's voice softened. "Clara Morris." He stood immediately. "Send her in." Clara entered a moment later, clutching a small paper bag. Her uniform was neat but plain. Her posture both nervous and steady. "I'm sorry for coming unannounced, Mr. Vale. I just wanted to thank you." Ethan gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "You don't need to thank me, Clara. You already did that the day you reminded me what matters." She smiled faintly, lowering herself into the seat. "Jamie wanted you to have this." She handed him the paper bag. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a drawing. Crayon on white construction paper. A tall building with blue lights, a sun peeking behind clouds, and two stick figures standing under falling snow. One wore glasses, the other held a lunchbox. At the bottom, written in a child's uneven handwriting, "Thank you for keeping us warm. Jamie." Ethan stared at the drawing for a long moment, his throat tightening. "He drew this?" Clara nodded, smiling shyly. "He said it's the city. The lights are warmth traveling to people." Ethan's gaze softened. "He sees more clearly than most adults I know." They sat quietly for a moment, the city lights shimmering through the glass behind them. Then Clara said, "I heard you on the radio this morning. You said compassion can't be outsourced. The technology should serve people, not replace them." "I meant it," Ethan said, "and it's people like you who prove it." She looked down, embarrassed. "I'm just a maid, Mr. Vale." "No," he said firmly. "You're the reason this entire project exists. That doesn't make you just anything." Her eyes shimmered as she met his gaze. "You're different now." "Maybe I'm just finally awake," he said. Clara stood, gripping her coat. "Well, I should get back. The mansion won't clean itself." He chuckled softly. "You know, I'm starting to think it might survive a few hours without you." Her smile widened. "Not if you're the one making coffee." He laughed quietly as she left. When the door closed behind her, Ethan looked down at the drawing again. The lunchbox and crayon, the snow falling gently between two figures. It was simple, innocent, and truer than any business plan he'd ever written. He set it on his desk, pressing it flat beneath the glass surface, where it would stay visible every day. By afternoon, the snow began to fall again, thick and soft. Outside, the city shimmered in white. Ethan stood before a wall of monitors displaying live feeds of the Hearthlight grid, tiny pulses of energy flowing to homes across Boston. Each flicker on the map represented a family staying warm, a child breathing easier, an elderly couple safe through the night. He realized with quiet certainty that this, not profit margins, not awards, not headlines, was the real measure of success. When evening came, he drove himself home, refusing the driver for once. The mansion stood luminous against the snow, but it no longer felt like a fortress. Inside, the staff were laughing softly near the kitchen, sharing cocoa. The air was alive, human. Ethan paused by the doorway, watching without interrupting. Then he smiled, genuine, small, and new. He walked upstairs to his study, where the gray-blue scarf lay neatly folded on the mantel, the same one Clara had once worn, the same color as the sky before a storm. He touched the fabric gently, his voice a whisper. "I finally understand, Mom. Warmth isn't what you build, it's what you share." Outside, the snow continued to fall, and this time Ethan didn't feel the chill at all. That night, Boston glowed under a veil of snow. Streetlights shimmered like beacons through the frost, and every rooftop looked painted in silver. From his office window, Ethan watched the city breathe. For the first time in years, he didn't see graphs or projections. He saw homes, people, warmth. He stayed at his desk long after midnight, the only light in the mansion coming from his office. In front of him lay Jamie's drawing, pinned neatly beneath the glass. Each time his eyes drifted to the lunchbox sketched in crayon, he felt something loosen in his chest, a weight uncoiling, like frost melting from glass. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at his eyes. Yet beneath it, there was peace. When he finally fell asleep, he dreamed. Not of boardrooms or screens, but of his mother humming by a fire that barely warmed the room. In the dream, she turned to him and smiled. "You found it, Ethan," she whispered. "The warmth I told you about." He woke before dawn, that whisper still echoing in his ears. Downstairs, the house was quiet. The old grandfather clock ticked like a heartbeat in the foyer. Ethan made coffee and carried it out to the back terrace. The snow was fresh again, untouched, glimmering blue in the early light. He stood there, coat unbuttoned despite the cold, and breathed in the clean winter air. That was when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Gregory. "Turn on Channel 8. They're talking about Hearthlight." Ethan stepped back inside, switched on the television, and froze. A local reporter stood in front of a small brick apartment complex. Clara's building. The news anchor's voice came through the speakers, gentle but urgent. "When the Hearthlight program rerouted emergency power last week, this Dorchester apartment was one of the first to receive heat. A single mother here says the system saved her child from an asthma attack during the storm." The camera panned to Clara standing in her doorway, Jamie tucked under her arm. She wasn't in uniform. She was just a mother, her face shy but proud. "I never expected anyone to notice us," Clara said softly. "But this program, it made us feel seen." The reporter smiled. "And what would you say to the man behind it?" Clara looked down at Jamie, then straight into the camera. "I'd tell him thank you, not just for the heat, but for remembering what warmth really means." Ethan sat motionless. Her words, simple, sincere, landed like a quiet storm. He felt an unfamiliar sting behind his eyes. When the segment ended, the camera fading to the anchor's sign-off, Ethan turned off the TV and stood for a long time in silence. The house seemed to hum with a stillness he hadn't noticed before, not empty, but calm. Later that morning, when Clara arrived for work, she found him waiting in the foyer, coat in hand. "Morning, sir," she said carefully, unsure of his expression. He smiled faintly. "I saw the interview." Her cheeks flushed pink. "Oh, that. I didn't know they'd use it on air. I'm sorry if it caused any—" "Don't apologize," he interrupted gently. "You spoke truth. It's what people needed to hear." Clara exhaled, relief softening her shoulders. "Jamie was excited. He kept saying we were on TV." Ethan chuckled. "He deserves to be. He reminded me that warmth can't just be distributed. It has to be seen." She smiled, unsure what to say. "Thank you, Mr. Vale." He shook his head. "No, Clara. Thank you for letting the world see what this really means." For the next week, calls poured in. News outlets wanted interviews. Nonprofits offered partnerships. The mayor's office requested Ethan's presence at City Hall to discuss expanding Hearthlight statewide. For the first time, Ethan accepted every meeting. Not for publicity, but because he wanted to keep building the thing that had given his life meaning again. At the City Hall conference, the mayor, a woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake, praised his efforts publicly. "Mr. Vale, this initiative has saved lives. You've changed how we think about technology and compassion." Ethan smiled humbly. "Thank you, Mayor. But if you really want to thank someone, find the people who live behind the data. They're the ones who remind us what we're building for." When the applause faded, he stepped outside into the thin winter sunlight. Photographers called his name, but he barely noticed. Across the square, a small group of school children had gathered around a Hearthlight mobile station, handing out free thermal gloves. One of the kids, a little boy in a red scarf, waved up at him. Ethan smiled and waved back. The boy's mother looked up too, recognition dawning on her face. She smiled with gratitude, the kind that needed no words. Ethan felt something shift again, an invisible thread connecting him to the people who, until recently, had been nothing more than numbers in his system. That night, he returned to the mansion later than usual. The staff had finished their shifts. The house was quiet again. He set down his briefcase, walked into the kitchen and found the gray-blue scarf still folded neatly on the counter where he'd left it. He picked it up and stepped outside into the cold. Snowflakes landed softly on his shoulders as he draped the scarf around his neck. It still smelled faintly of detergent, but it carried something else now too, something human, something warm. He stood there a long while, breathing in the night. Above him, the sky was streaked with faint auroras, soft green and blue light swirling through the darkness. The city below glimmered, alive with heat and heart. Ethan whispered into the still air, "This is what she meant, Mom. This is what warmth feels like." And for the first time since he could remember, the cold didn't touch him. The blizzard had ended days ago, but traces of it lingered in every quiet corner of Boston. The snow packed along the curbs, the icicles glinting like crystal above storefronts, the hush that fell over streets once the sun went down. In that hush, Ethan Vale found a kind of peace he'd never known. Project Hearthlight had spread faster than anyone expected. Within a week, other cities reached out. New York, Chicago, even Denver, asking how to replicate the system. Ethan could have called it a victory. Investors certainly did, but for him, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like repair. He was sitting in his office one evening, the skyline glowing blue beyond the glass, when Gregory stepped in. "The mayor called," he said. "They're naming you Humanitarian of the Year." Ethan looked up slowly. "That's unnecessary," Gregory chuckled. "Tell that to the press. They already have your photo on billboards." Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his jaw. "The world loves a redemption story, Greg. But the truth is, I didn't change overnight." Gregory folded his arms. "Maybe not overnight, but you did change, and it's good for people to see that." Ethan gave a small nod. "You know what I realized? The more we chase progress, the easier it becomes to forget the people progress was meant to serve." Gregory hesitated, then said quietly, "You sound like your mother." That caught Ethan off guard. "You knew her?" "Not personally," Gregory admitted, "but you mentioned her once, years ago. You said she used to say warmth isn't about temperature, it's about dignity." Ethan smiled faintly, remembering. Yeah, she did. When Gregory left, the office fell into soft silence again. Ethan turned toward the window. Across the city, rooftops glowed with faint blue dots on his Hearthlight tracker, homes receiving redistributed power. Each light pulsed like a heartbeat. He closed his laptop and reached for his coat. Tonight, he wasn't going home. An hour later, his car rolled into Dorchester, tires crunching over frozen slush. The same street where Clara lived looked different now, brighter, steadier. The new generator installation glowed faintly beside the building, humming with life. He parked and stepped into the cold, his breath rising in pale clouds. Through a window, he saw movement. Clara was inside, stirring a pot on the stove. Jamie sat at the kitchen table, drawing again, crayons scattered around him. Warm light filled the room. Ethan hesitated before knocking. Clara opened the door, surprise flickering across her face. "Mr. Vale." "Sorry for stopping by unannounced," he said quickly. "I was in the neighborhood." She smiled, crossing her arms lightly. "People like you don't just happen to be in Dorchester." He laughed softly. "Fair point." Jamie looked up from his seat. "Mom, it's him," he whispered loudly, eyes bright. "The man from TV." Ethan crouched slightly to meet his gaze. "Hey, Jamie? Drawing again?" Jamie nodded proudly. "I'm making another one. This time it's the city and the stars." "Can I see it?" The boy handed him the half-finished paper. It showed the Boston skyline beneath a sky full of swirling colors, green, blue, and violet arcs like northern lights. "It's beautiful," Ethan said, studying the child's work. "You have an eye for light." Jamie grinned. "Mom says light can find you, even in storms." Clara blushed faintly, glancing down. "He listens more than I realize." Ethan smiled. "He's right, though." He handed the drawing back. "You know, Jamie, I'm working on a new project. Maybe you can help me name it." Jamie's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really," Ethan said. "It's about bringing light to places that never had it before." Jamie thought for a moment, chewing his pencil. "What about Winter Star? Because stars show people where home is." Ethan froze, the simplicity of it piercing him. Then he nodded slowly. "Winter Star," he repeated. "That's perfect." Clara smiled, but her voice was quiet. "You really don't have to do all this, Mr. Vale." "I know," Ethan said, "but I want to." A gust of wind rattled the window pane. The warmth inside felt richer against it. He looked around the small apartment, the new heater humming softly, the scent of stew filling the air, Jamie humming as he colored. It wasn't luxury, but it was peace, and it was enough. "I should go," Ethan said finally. "You two have dinner to finish." Clara followed him to the door. "Wait." She disappeared for a second, then returned holding something small wrapped in tissue paper. "Jamie wanted to give you this." Ethan unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a tiny snow globe, the kind sold at corner stores. Inside it, a miniature city sparkled beneath falling glitter. The base was scratched, the glass slightly fogged, but it caught the light beautifully. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Tell him I'll keep it in my office." Clara nodded. "He'll be thrilled." Ethan paused, then met her eyes. "Clara, if there's ever anything you need, anything at all, don't wait until the next storm." She smiled softly. "I think we'll be all right now, sir." He gave a small nod, stepped outside, and pulled his scarf tight against the wind. From the car, he looked back once. Through the frosted window, he saw Clara and Jamie laughing at the dinner table, the room glowing like a lantern against the winter dark. As he drove away, he held the little snow globe in his hand. The glitter swirled gently inside, catching the light from passing street lamps. He thought about the boy's words. Stars show people where home is. For the first time in his life, Ethan realized he had found his. The following morning brought a soft, silver stillness to Boston. The storm had passed, leaving the city wrapped in light mist and faint bird song. Sunlight struck the glass towers downtown, scattering reflections like shards of gold across the streets. Ethan stood on the terrace of his office, his breath visible in the crisp air. He'd been there since dawn, holding Jamie's little snow globe in his hand. Inside it, flakes shimmered as they fell over a tiny city, fragile, hopeful, eternal. For years, he'd built systems to measure the physical warmth of a place, grid temperatures, kilowatt output, heat retention curves. But that morning, he realized warmth wasn't data. It was continuity. It was people carrying light for one another when the sky went dark. When he stepped back inside, Gregory was waiting. "You're early," he said, half amused. "Again." Ethan smiled faintly. "I think I like the quiet before the world wakes up." Gregory handed him a folder. "The Hearthlight report. Final numbers. We've already surpassed projections, but there's something else." He hesitated. "The board's concerned. They say you're giving too much away." Ethan took the folder but didn't open it. "Then maybe they should stop counting what's given away and start measuring what's saved." Gregory exhaled, shaking his head. "You've become impossible to argue with." "Finally," Ethan said, a ghost of a grin flickering across his face. By midday, he was back in the conference room, but this time the conversation wasn't about profits or expansions. It was about partnerships with local shelters, hospitals, and even public schools. Clara's quiet courage had rippled into something larger. Hearthlight was no longer a corporate initiative. It was becoming a movement. When the meeting ended, Ethan returned to his office and stared out the window. Below, the city pulsed with life. Steam rising from subway grates, snow melting into gutters, pedestrians hurrying with scarves pulled tight. For the first time, he saw beauty in the ordinary. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Unknown. "Mr. Vale, this is Jamie. Mom said I could text you. My teacher showed my drawing to the class today. Everyone liked it." Ethan smiled, typing back, "You're a real artist, Jamie. Keep showing people what warmth looks like." A reply came almost instantly. "Mom says you sound like Grandpa." Ethan froze, his breath catching. The words hit something deep and unguarded. He looked up at the photo of his mother on the wall, the same gentle smile, the same steady eyes. "Do I?" he whispered. He closed his eyes and exhaled. "I hope so." That evening, the mayor hosted a small reception to honor the Hearthlight launch. It was held at the Frostline Pavilion, a glass atrium overlooking the frozen river. The city's elite mingled with engineers, volunteers, and families whose lives had been changed by the project. When Ethan arrived, he moved quietly through the crowd, shaking hands, listening more than speaking. It wasn't his kind of room anymore, too much noise, too many cameras, but he stayed because it mattered. He found Clara near the back, wearing a modest navy coat and the same calm expression she always carried. Jamie stood beside her in a tiny borrowed blazer, holding a program booklet twice his size. When he spotted Ethan, his face lit up. "Mr. Vale!" Ethan crouched slightly, smiling. "You clean up well, Jamie." The boy grinned. "Mom said I had to behave like a gentleman, but they gave me soda and it's really fizzy." Ethan laughed softly. "That's a dangerous combination." Clara shook her head, smiling. "I told him one glass." Ethan glanced around the glittering room. "You both deserve to be here more than anyone." Clara's smile faded a little. "I'm not sure I belong in a place like this." He turned to face her fully. "You belong anywhere kindness is honored." She looked down, her cheeks warming. "That's kind of you to say." "It's true," Ethan said. "Without you, none of this would exist." A voice crackled over the microphone near the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin the ceremony." Ethan motioned toward the seats. "Come sit near the front." Clara hesitated. "That's for officials." "You're the reason they're here," he said gently. As the lights dimmed, the mayor took the stage. "Tonight," she began, "we celebrate not just innovation, but humanity. Project Hearthlight reminded us that the best technology doesn't replace compassion. It extends it." Applause rippled through the room. The mayor gestured toward Ethan. "Please join me in recognizing Mr. Ethan Vale." He stood to polite clapping but shook his head. "I'd like someone else to stand with me," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "The person who taught me what real warmth means." The crowd stirred, curious. Ethan turned toward Clara. "Clara Morris, would you join me?" Gasps fluttered across the audience. Clara froze, color rushing to her face. "Mr. Vale, I can't—" "You can," he said softly. Jamie tugged her sleeve. "Go, Mom." Reluctantly, she rose and walked to the stage, every step trembling. The mayor smiled as Ethan handed her the microphone. "Clara," he said, "when I first saw you, you were sitting outside in the snow, eating from a lunchbox because you didn't want to disturb anyone. That moment changed me. It reminded me that warmth doesn't come from systems or circuits. It comes from people like you." The audience was silent. The words fell heavy, real. Clara looked out over the crowd. Executives, donors, politicians, and then at Ethan beside her. "I didn't do anything special," she said softly. "I just kept showing up." Ethan's voice was gentle. "Sometimes that's the most special thing of all." Applause broke out, not the polite kind, but the genuine kind that swells when truth fills a room. When the noise finally faded, Ethan leaned closer and whispered, "Thank you for everything." Clara smiled through tears. "You don't have to thank me anymore." But he did, because without her, he might never have remembered who he was. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the lights of the pavilion reflected on the ice outside, Ethan stepped onto the terrace. The city glowed beneath him, hearthlight pulses blinking faintly across rooftops like stars. Clara joined him quietly, her breath clouding in the air. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded. "It is." Jamie said the lights looked like the sky smiling back. Ethan smiled. Maybe he's right. They stood there in silence, side by side as snow began to fall again. Slow, steady, peaceful. And for once, Ethan Vale didn't see a storm. He saw grace. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the pale winter haze like the memory of warmth itself. Boston glistened. Ribbons of snow still clinging to rooftops. Sidewalks wet with thaw. The city looked alive again. Inside the mansion, Ethan sat at the breakfast table, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him. The air was calm, unhurried, filled with a quiet kind of peace that didn't exist here before. The TV on the wall played muted news coverage from the night before. Clips of him and Clara on stage, the audience's applause, the mayor's closing words. "The man who taught machines to feel warmth finally learned it himself," the anchor said. Ethan smiled faintly. "A bit dramatic," he muttered, setting the remote down. Across the table, Clara was helping finalize the new staff schedules, her handwriting neat, deliberate. She looked different now, confident, grounded, though her humility never left her. "Jamie woke up early," she said, glancing up. "He insisted on finishing a thank you card for you before school." Ethan's smile softened. "He's becoming quite the artist." Clara chuckled quietly. "He says he wants to build something like you one day." Ethan leaned back, thoughtful. "I hope he builds something better." Their eyes met briefly, a small current of understanding passing between them. No hierarchy, no divide, just two people who had crossed a storm together and come out changed. The phone rang, breaking the quiet. Ethan answered, listening for a few moments before his expression hardened slightly. "That was the board," he said, lowering the receiver. "They're concerned about the cost of the Hearthlight expansion. Some think I've gone too far." Clara frowned. "And have you?" Ethan's answer was firm. "Not nearly far enough." He rose and walked to the window. Outside, workers were unloading new heat modules, sleek metal boxes destined for underfunded housing complexes. Watching them, he thought of his mother again, her hands red from scrubbing tile, her laughter echoing through cold halls, her constant refrain. "Warmth isn't built, Ethan. It's shared." He turned back to Clara. "I want to visit the distribution center today, see where everything's going." "I'll come with you," she said immediately. He smiled. "You don't have to." "I know," she replied, "but I want to." The Hearthlight distribution hub stood in an old converted train depot south of downtown. Rows of volunteers in orange vests moved between stacks of generators, wiring kits, and thermal blankets. The air buzzed with purpose. When Ethan and Clara arrived, the chatter dimmed. Workers straightened. Whispers rippled through the space. A man approached. Luis Ramirez, the operations foreman. "Mr. Vale, I can't tell you how much this means. People think you saved the city." Ethan shook his head. "No, Luis. You did. I just made sure someone noticed." Luis grinned, humbled. "Still, thank you." Ethan walked down the aisles, Clara beside him as the volunteers loaded supply vans. Every box bore a single symbol, a small, golden flame over the words, "No one cold." Clara stopped beside one of the crates, tracing the label with her glove. "Jamie's going to love this logo," she said softly. "He already helped name the next phase," Ethan replied. "Project Winter Star. It'll expand Hearthlight to remote regions." Her head lifted in surprise. "You're naming it after his idea?" Ethan smiled. "He's the reason I had one." Clara's eyes shone with quiet pride. He'll never forget that. They walked toward the loading dock, where a cold wind rushed through the open doors. Outside, volunteers were handing out portable heaters to residents from nearby shelters. One older woman took Ethan's hand as she passed. "You don't know what this means to us," she said, her voice shaking. "For the first time in years, I'm not afraid of winter." Ethan's throat tightened. No one should be. Clara watched him, something gentle and unspoken in her eyes. Later, when they returned to the car, she said softly, "You really are your mother's son." He blinked, startled. "You knew about her?" "Jamie told me," she said. "You mentioned her once, remember? About how she worked hard so you could study. He asked me what kind of person she was." Ethan nodded slowly. "She was good. The kind of good that doesn't ask to be noticed." Clara smiled. "Then she'd be proud of what you've done." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was warm, like shared understanding. As the car wound through the snowy streets back toward Beacon Hill, Ethan looked out at the city he'd once ruled through data and now served through compassion. Billboards still bore his company's sleek blue logo, but beneath it were the words his mother once said to him as a child. "Warmth belongs to everyone." That night he stayed late in his office again. The lights of the city shimmered below, Hearthlight's grid alive and pulsing like veins of gold. Clara's scarf hung neatly beside his coat on the rack. Next to it, Jamie's crayon drawing was pinned on the wall. Boston under falling snow, two figures standing together. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at it, until something in him quietly broke and rebuilt all at once. A week later, the first shipments of Project Winter Star left Boston Harbor, bound for Chicago, Detroit, and beyond. The program was expanding, not through corporations, but through communities. That evening, Ethan hosted a small dinner for the volunteers who'd made it happen. It wasn't in the mansion's grand dining room, but in the staff hall, where everyone, drivers, cooks, engineers, janitors, sat together at long wooden tables. Laughter filled the room, rising above the clink of dishes and the crackle of the fireplace. Clara sat near the end, watching him quietly. When the dinner ended, Ethan raised his glass. "To everyone who taught me that warmth isn't a luxury, it's a responsibility." They cheered, their voices carrying through the hall. Clara's eyes met his across the table, full of pride, gratitude, and something deeper neither dared to name. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, silent, forgiving. And this time, Ethan didn't see a storm to overcome. He saw a promise kept. By the time February arrived, Boston had turned to a city of light, street lamps glowing through sheets of falling snow, windows flickering warm in neighborhoods that used to go dark during storms. The Hearthlight system had grown into something far larger than Ethan ever imagined. Every night, he watched the live map from his office, thousands of golden points spreading outward like embers carried by the wind. Each pulse meant a home with power. Each glow meant someone was safe. He'd always measured success in numbers before: share prices, patents, acquisitions. Now he measured it in light. The world noticed. Newspapers called him the man who warmed a city. Technology forums named Neurodyne a model for ethical innovation. But when interviewers asked about his inspiration, he always gave the same quiet answer: a woman eating lunch in the snow. He never mentioned her name, but the city started whispering. Some thought she was a metaphor. Others said she was real. Only Ethan and Clara knew the truth. That winter morning, the mansion's main hall was filled with volunteers preparing shipments of Hearthlight modules for smaller towns north of the city. Clara supervised with calm authority, clipboard in hand, while Ethan stood nearby packing boxes himself. "You don't have to do that," she said, smiling. "I know," he replied, sealing the crate. "That's why I should." He handed her a label marked "Wow Winter Star, Phase 1, and nodded toward the next stack. "Jamie's name is going to be printed on every one of these." Her eyes widened. "You're serious?" He grinned. "Of course, it's his design. He deserves credit." Clara blinked rapidly, emotion flooding her face. "He's going to lose his mind." "He already built the name," Ethan said gently. "I'm just making sure the world remembers who lit the first spark." As they worked, one of the new hires, an intern barely out of college, approached with a question about data routing. Ethan knelt beside him, explaining the process with patience that surprised even himself. When the young man thanked him, Ethan smiled. "One day, you'll teach someone else. That's how warmth travels." Clara watched from across the room, admiration soft in her expression. Later that afternoon, when the last truck rolled out of the drive, Ethan stood beside her in the entryway, watching taillights fade into the snow. "You ever think about how strange it is," he said quietly, "that all this started with a single lunchbox?" Clara turned to him, the corners of her mouth lifting. "Sometimes the smallest moments change everything." He looked at her then, not as an employer, not as a benefactor, but as someone who had come to mean more than he'd ever expected. The silence between them was gentle, filled with the hum of something unspoken. Before he could respond, her phone buzzed. She smiled at the screen. "It's Jamie. He says he got an A on his science project. Wants to show you the video." Ethan chuckled. "Tell him to send it to me." "He already did," she said, holding the phone out. On the screen, Jamie stood in his classroom beside a small homemade model labeled "Heat for Everyone." He grinned proudly as he explained how warmth could travel through wires and kindness alike. At the end, he waved at the camera. "Hi, Mr. Vale. Mom says you make heat with computers, but I think you make it with your heart." Ethan couldn't speak for a moment. His throat tightened. When he finally did, his voice was rougher than he intended. "He's a remarkable kid." Clara smiled softly. "He takes after his mother." He met her gaze and nodded slowly. "I think he takes after both of us." The moment lingered, quiet, fragile, and real. That evening, Ethan drove alone to the outskirts of the city where an old train yard had been converted into a Hearthlight testing facility. The ground was blanketed in snow, untouched and perfect. Engineers greeted him as he stepped out of the car. "Sir, we're about to activate the Winter Star prototype," one said. Ethan nodded. "Go ahead." From the control center, they initiated the sequence. Across the frozen yard, dozens of small towers flickered to life, pale gold light spilling into the darkness. Each tower carried a microgrid transmitter that could extend warmth to remote villages, shelters, even mobile hospitals. Ethan stepped into the cold, the wind cutting across his face. But as the light spread, the chill faded. The air seemed softer, alive. He tilted his head back, watching how the glow mirrored the stars above. Gregory approached quietly behind him. "It's beautiful," he said. "It's only the beginning," Ethan murmured. He stood there for a long moment, the scarf around his neck fluttering gently in the wind, the same gray-blue wool Clara had once worn. It felt like carrying a piece of both the past and the future at once. When he finally returned to the car, he sent a text to Clara. "The stars are shining tonight. Tell Jamie his light reached them." She replied a minute later. "He says he always knew it would." Ethan smiled. Weeks passed. The city warmed. Stories spread of people whose lives had changed. A nurse whose hospital ward stayed powered through a blackout. An elderly couple who no longer had to sleep in their coats. Children who could study through the night without fear of freezing. Ethan started visiting these places quietly. No cameras, no entourage. Sometimes he'd bring Coco. Sometimes he'd just listen. Everywhere he went, people thanked him, but he always told them the same thing. "Thank someone who reminded me what warmth looks like." And when he returned home each night, he'd stop by the study window where Clara's scarf hung beside Jamie's drawing. He'd look out over the snow-covered city glowing softly below and whisper the same words to himself, half prayer, half promise. No one should ever eat in the snow again. The calendar turned to March, but winter refused to let go. Boston's air still carried a knife's edge, though the streets pulsed with new life. Vendors reopening their stalls, children chasing patches of sunlight through alleys, the city shaking off its frost like a waking animal. From his penthouse window, Ethan Vale watched it all, hands resting on the cold glass. The world below glowed brighter than ever. His world, once a monument to calculation, now humming with warmth that couldn't be measured. Project Hearthlight had spread across 5 states, and now, with WinterStar ready to launch nationally, the board was calling it the greatest innovation in human-centered technology since the Internet. But Ethan didn't feel like a man at the top. He felt like a man finally level with everyone else. A knock sounded behind him. Clara stepped in, wearing a dark peacoat and scarf. His scarf, the gray-blue one he'd returned to her that morning with a note. "For the one who showed me what warmth is." "Sorry to interrupt," she said softly. "Jamie's school asked if you'd speak at their winter benefit next week. He volunteered you before asking." Ethan turned, smiling. "He did he?" "He said you tell better stories than anyone," she teased. He chuckled. "I doubt that, but I'll go." Her eyes softened. "He'll be thrilled." A brief silence followed, comfortable, almost domestic. The snow outside blurred into soft white streaks against the glass, and for a moment it felt like time itself had paused in that gentle hush between them. Then Ethan cleared his throat. "Clara, I wanted to ask you something." She looked up, curious. He hesitated, searching for words. "You've seen what Hearthlight's become. We're opening community centers in each city, safe spaces for people during the winter months. I'd like you to lead that program. Full-time. You'd be managing hundreds of volunteers, coordinating with local shelters, hospitals." Her eyes widened. "Me? Ethan, I don't have the education for that." "Yes, you do," he said firmly. "You have the empathy this work needs. The rest we can teach." She stared at him, speechless. "You really think I can do this?" "I don't think it," Ethan said quietly. "I know it." Her breath caught. For a moment, all she could do was nod, eyes glistening. "Then I'll do it. For Jamie. For everyone who's ever been cold." Ethan smiled. Warm, proud, unguarded. "Good. That's exactly why I chose you." A week later, the benefit at Jamie's school drew a modest crowd. Parents, teachers, and neighborhood families still recovering from the hard winter. The gymnasium was decorated with strings of paper snowflakes, each one hand-cut by the students. Ethan stood near the back, watching Jamie race between tables, chattering about how his mom was going to save the whole city. Clara laughed, chasing after him with that tired, radiant patience only a mother could have. When it was time for speeches, Jamie tugged Ethan toward the small stage. "Come on, tell them the story about the snow." Ethan took the microphone, a little unsure of how to begin. The crowd fell silent. He glanced at Clara, who gave a small nod. I used to think warmth came from machines, he began, his voice low but steady, that if you built enough systems, wrote enough code, you could fix the cold. But this winter, I learned something very different. He looked toward the back of the room, where a few parents still wore coats indoors. I learned that warmth is something you pass on. It's in a kind word, a shared meal, a light left on for someone who's late coming home. It's in people, ordinary people, who refuse to look away. Clara's eyes shone. Jamie beamed up at him. And when one person carries warmth, Ethan said softly, it spreads faster than any network I've ever built. Applause rose, gentle, heartfelt, the kind that came from people who understood because they'd lived it. Afterward, parents came to shake his hand, thanking him not for his wealth or title, but for remembering them. One woman said, "We lost power for 3 days before your system came online. My husband cried when the heat returned. We thought no one saw us." Ethan smiled gently. Someone did. And now, so will everyone. Later that night, after the gym emptied and the volunteers began taking down decorations, Ethan found himself alone by the window, watching snow swirl under the floodlights outside. Clara joined him quietly, holding 2 cups of cocoa. "Do you ever think," she said softly, "that maybe your mother sent me to remind you?" He looked at her, the question settling like a spark in the air. "I think," he said slowly, "you reminded me of her." Clara smiled faintly. "She raised a good man." Ethan's gaze lingered on her face, on the way the light caught in her hair, soft and amber. "She raised a cold one. You taught him how to thaw." The silence between them deepened, warm, alive. "Clara," he said quietly, "when this started, I wanted to build a system that could outlast me. Now I realize the only thing that ever will is kindness." She looked down at her cup, smiling through tears. "Then I guess you finally built what your mother wanted all along." He nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Maybe I did." They stood side by side as snow fell thick again. Soft, white, endless. But the world didn't feel cold anymore. 2 weeks later, Project Winter Star went live across the Midwest. Thousands of families found warmth flickering back into their homes after years of unreliable heat. In a quiet neighborhood near the harbor, a mother and her son hung a framed letter on their wall, an official thank you from the Vail Foundation, signed simply, "For reminding the world that warmth begins with one act of grace." And on Beacon Hill, in the mansion that once echoed with emptiness, laughter returned. Ethan walked the halls no longer as a man haunted by ambition, but as one restored by humanity. He often paused at the window by the grand staircase, the same one where he'd first seen Clara in the snow. Outside, the courtyard gleamed beneath the last frost of the season. He whispered to the memory, "You taught me, Mom. Warmth isn't built. It's lived." The scarf still hung on the back of his chair, and Jamie's drawing still watched over his desk. And as spring sunlight melted the final traces of ice from the stone paths, Ethan Vail finally realized. The snow hadn't been his punishment. It had been his invitation to rediscover the heart he'd buried beneath success. The last snow of the season fell softly over Boston that morning, quiet flakes drifting through pale gold light, dissolving before they ever touched the ground. Spring was close enough to taste in the air, yet winter lingered like a memory that refused to fade. In the Vail mansion, the fireplace burned low, its warmth reaching through the halls not as a luxury, but as a comfort freely shared. The staff no longer hurried past one another in silence. Laughter and conversation now filled spaces that had once felt hollow. Ethan stood by the same window where it all began, the glass faintly fogged from the heat behind him. The world outside shimmered, a city transformed, not by his inventions alone, but by something deeper. Behind him, Clara approached, dressed for the chill, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "You're up early," she said, smiling softly. He turned. "Couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts." She joined him at the window, the two of them standing side by side, watching the last traces of snow melt into the garden paths. "It's hard to believe how much has changed," she murmured. Ethan nodded. "I used to think change was about progress. Now I think it's about compassion." Clara smiled, glancing at him. "Jamie says compassion is a kind of superpower." He chuckled. He's not wrong. A comfortable silence settled between them. In the months since that bitter blizzard, they'd learned to speak in small words, quiet glances, shared purpose. The distance between their worlds, once a chasm, had become something gentler, bridgeable. Ethan gestured toward the folded gray-blue scarf hanging near the door. "You left this again." She laughed softly. "Maybe it belongs here now." He picked it up, running his fingers over the worn wool. "You know, I used to see this and think of cold. Now it just reminds me of courage." Her eyes softened. "It reminds me of kindness." Outside, a bird landed on the frost-coated railing, a small, defiant spark of life against the white. Clara followed its movement and whispered, "Do you ever think about that first day, when you saw me out there?" "I think about it every day," he said quietly. "It's strange, isn't it? How one moment can change everything." She nodded. "You built a system that warms millions, Ethan. But what you did for one person changed the man who built it." He looked at her, something fragile and honest in his eyes. "You're the reason I remembered who I was." Before she could answer, the doorbell chimed. A courier stood outside, cheeks red from the cold, holding a small envelope. Ethan signed for it and handed it to Clara. "It's addressed to you," he said. She opened it, brow furrowing. Inside was an invitation embossed with gold lettering. The Vale Foundation, Annual Gala of Gratitude. Her name was listed under the evening's honorees. Clara looked up, startled. "Ethan, I can't." "You can," he interrupted softly. "You deserve to be recognized, not as an employee, but as the person who inspired it all." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't need awards." "I know," he said gently, "but the world needs to see what humility looks like when it changes everything." That night, under a sky washed clean by the last snow, the gala filled the Frostline Pavilion again. But this time, it wasn't a celebration of profits or progress. It was a gathering of people who had known the bite of winter and the miracle of warmth restored. Clara stood at the podium, nervous at first until she saw Jamie in the front row, grinning proudly. Ethan stood beside him, his expression calm and proud. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "I'm not an inventor. I'm not a leader. I'm just someone who believed kindness matters even when no one's watching. If this story teaches anything, it's that every small act, every gesture of grace, creates a chain reaction. Warmth spreads, and when it does, no one stands in the cold alone." Applause swelled, not thunderous but deeply human, like the beating of 1,000 hearts in sync. Ethan stepped onto the stage as she stepped down, offering her his hand. She took it without hesitation. "Beautifully said," he murmured. She smiled through tears. "You taught me to believe that people still listen." He shook his head slightly. "You taught me that some truths don't need volume, just honesty." They stood there as the crowd rose in a standing ovation, but for a moment, it felt as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them. The man who had once built warmth without feeling it, and the woman who showed him how. Later, as the evening wound down, Clara found Ethan outside on the terrace again, watching snowflakes fall like soft ash from a sky ready for spring. "You never tire of the view, do you?" she asked, joining him. He smiled faintly. "Not anymore. For a long time I looked out here and saw isolation. Now I see hope." The city below shimmered with golden light, the hearthlight grid alive, each home a tiny star in the constellation of compassion he'd built. Clara leaned on the railing beside him. "You've done something incredible, Ethan. You gave people warmth." He turned to her, eyes bright. "No, Clara, you reminded me what real wealth means." Her brow furrowed. Wealth? He nodded slowly. It's not what fills your hands. It's what fills your heart, and how much of it you can give away. Clara's eyes softened. Then you're the richest man I know. Ethan laughed quietly, shaking his head. Only because of what you gave back. They stood there together in silence, breath clouding in the gentle air. Below them, the city glowed like a field of stars. Somewhere in Dorchester, Jamie would be asleep, his dreams bright with color and warmth. And somewhere far above, perhaps, Ethan's mother would be smiling, her son finally living the lesson she'd spent her life teaching. Ethan turned toward Clara, his voice barely above a whisper. You reminded me that no invention, no fortune, can ever replace compassion. Clara met his gaze, her eyes glimmering beneath the soft snowlight. Then maybe that's the one thing we can never lose. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need to hide behind success or power anymore. As snow drifted around them, the world seemed to exhale. The city, the lights, the stars, all quietly, profoundly warm. And somewhere between the falling flakes and the rising dawn, Ethan Vale finally understood. The snow that once separated them had never been a barrier. It had been the bridge.